Hello, everybody, and we are here with Greg, Ruth for, I suppose, sort of a satellite session to AMPjam. We're recording this the day before it'll go out. Greg, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for inviting me onto this. It's great to see you and talk at long last.
It's really great to have you. The amount of every time you post something up on social media that you've drawn, I'm just like, damn, how does he do it? So it's great to finally meet you, to finally meet you in person. For those who aren't sort of familiar with what you do from a in terms of the clients that you might have, or you know, the work that you might produce, and the kinds of things that you create, and you know, the what you sort of draw, you know, be it something that's pop culture related or something that's, you know, an animal like the ones you've got behind you. If you could just give people a bit of an idea of the kind of your body of work, and yeah, that would be great.
Oh, I guess I originally came through and up through comics back in the 90s. And that's been the kind of spine that's run through the whole 25 or 30 so years of working. I think my first big moment was, it was a couple of things. There was a big, after 9/11, I was in New York, and there were a bunch of us doing, there were a bunch of these anthology books that came out that a lot of us in the industry kind of derisively called crying fireman comics, but they kind of were at the time. And I had gotten to do one that was very politically edgy and kind of calling out on the, oh my God, what happened? How could this happen? Kind of thing. There's a writer I worked with who was able to kind of say, like, there's a predictive chain of events that leads to this and this culture and the way that we behave in the Middle East and all this other stuff that's coming out. Not a popular opinion at the moment, but it caught Alan Moore's eye, and he was really effusive about it. And I think that had a big part of leading to my first big gig with Dark Horse Comics to do Freaks of the Heartland with Steve Niles, which was a tremendously fun experience, and came at a great time when I was just had a baby. My first boy was born, and we were leaving New York and moving out here to the country where we are now. I had no job, no health insurance, so it was a real, like a carry through that was really great. I'd done a bunch of, maybe half a dozen or so children's books as well. I did a music video for Prince and another one for Rob Thomas. And then a lot of just so many book covers, hundreds of book covers, and I did some political art and some editorial work, and started getting into posters 3 or 4 years ago. I can't really tell. It feels like it's been decades, but I don't think it's been that long. And I think my very first poster I ever did was with a private commission group to do To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a hugely personal, important kind of benchmark project for me. And it just kind of grew from there. Got looped in with the crazy kids over at Mondo, and have just been running like crazy with them lately. Especially the last 3 months, we have done, I don't even know if I can count. There's a lot that I can't talk about, but oh boy, it's all going to start landing in the next few weeks. Boyhood, that was just announced as part of the IFC partnership rollout, is coming. And they were so wonderful in terms of taking on the massive and insane scale of the Twin Peaks work that I'd done. I think it was 67 different pieces. They printed just about all of them in G-Clays. We did a big poster, had a big gallery show. It connected me with a lot of with David, and with a lot of the actors from the show, which was such a dream for me. I was such a huge fan, and I'm just finishing a few projects that are similar level bucket list dream jobs that, again, we'll find out later this fall. But yeah, it's been wild and really busy, but really just explosively fun. I mean, I love film, and being able to work so closely with filmmakers, like, and to kind of connect with them, whether it's Ari Aster for Hereditary and Midsummer, or the work that I do for Criterion for ongoing with them, and also my long, now decade old, longtime partnership with Ethan Hawke. We just did our second book. Meadowlark just came out on the heels of our first venture together, Inda. So it's been busy and a whole lot of fun. I don't know what to say. It's a lot.
No, it is a lot. But you must be incredibly busy. I'm surprised, because I know that you've been working so much on sort of the press tour, this virtual press tour for Meadowlark. For you to say that you've also got a lot coming out with Mondo, I'm like, where'd you find the time?
No sleep, and my family hasn't seen me for 6 years.
Before we get into posters, then, as you brought up Meadowlark, is there if you could tell us a little bit about it, because obviously I'm sure the poster world may be sort of aware of it. Some people will be very au fait, but if you could let people know a little bit about it, because obviously you've done the illustration work.
Sure, and the writing. Yeah.
And the writing.
So yep. Ethan and I got together on Inday he had a script for that film, and was really, after seeing my work on Conan, really felt like the graphic novel medium might be a good place to do that. And so that was different than Meadowlark, in that we were basically taking a huge forest of research and data and trying to pull a story out of it. It was really like I always describe it as like taking the Black Forest and then making a bonsai out of it that is still the Black Forest. And so that project was that own thing, while we were running around in the pre-COVID times doing book tour for that, which was back then, before all this mess, was a lot of plane flights, a lot of car rides. So we had a lot of time just together, just to shoot the shit and hang out. And we, at first we started talking about Inday 2. There was so much that we didn't really get to finish with Inda that we really wanted to, but there was this little nascent idea, this little crime germ that I had in mind, and we started to kind of play around with it, and we found like a virus. It just kind of got into us, and we started building on it. We're both parents. At the time, we were parents to kids that were 15, 16 and going through their particular apocalypses, and our relationships with them was really fraught. And I, know his family very well, and he's met mine, and we have this kind of intimate friendship, and we're sharing a lot of what was happening at the same time while we were developing this story about a father and son. It's Meadowlark's told over a single day, and it's kind of like this. You wake up in the morning with this kid and his father and this dysfunctional family, and it just kind of explodes into this kind of nightmarish kind of crime spree that comes at the consequence of his father's poor decisions he's made, and it becomes very quickly about surviving and protecting themselves and their family by its end. So it was a scarier thing to do for us at the time, because we had done Inday 1, and the idea of doing a second one was certainly something that was really delicious to us, but having run the gamut of pulling off Inday wasn't nearly as terrifying as taking on something that we just kind of come up with on our own in our own sandbox playtime, to be able to convince people that it has value, and also the really deep personal kind of autobiographical connection it has with us. It's set in Huntsville, Texas, which is really a prison town. Richard Linklater came up with the greatest way to describe it, because he grew up in Huntsville. He says like half the town is in the prison and the other half are the guards. So it's really a very one industry kind of place. And it's where we set the book. And I grew up in Houston, and Ethan hails from Austin. So we have a lot of common kind of background there, and experience growing up and being connected with Texas still for the both of us. So it was just it was a time for me to be able to kind of reconnect with my roots in a way that was really cathartic, and for us to really develop something kind of completely invented ourselves was really marvelous and is really kind of lit our fires in terms of other things as well. It's just been a dream project, and it's been so great to see it come together. I mean, they did such an amazing job with the production of this thing. I very rarely get anything from the printer, the publisher, where I am not a little mad at myself or disappointed with what I've, like it just wasn't quite good enough, or oh, I wish I caught that screw up. Like, there's not. This thing's been perfect. It's been amazing to be able to have it and to hold it and to, we were kind of dreaming this dream together for about 3 or 4 years, and to actually have it be physical is remarkable. So we're having a lot of fun getting it in people's hands right now.
So how does the, I say we will get to posters, but I'm going to use this as a sort of a segue.
Sure.
How does the process, the process of creating the artwork for a piece, for this, contrast with your poster work? I mean, is it the immediate thing, it would be, oh, it's going to be a much more of an undertaking.
It is. It really is. It's enormous. Comics is an enormous, burdensome addiction to get into. I love it to death, and I tell everybody looking to get into it to stay as far away from it as possible. It will eat your time and life. It's years. I mean, I think Inde alone was 10 years of work. You will never, you never, and both of these books, I'll give them to like my kid to read, and it'll be done in 15 minutes. And you're like, oh, it's like almost as bad as animators. Like you spend years of your life on something that rolls by in 3 seconds, and you just feel like you want to jump off a bridge. It doesn't ever love you back. You do, like any serious drug addiction, I guess. But there's something really rewarding about it and really mentally challenging that I really love. It's a marvelous playground for storytelling. And that's really where I come from. And so for both of these, we adopted a new method that I was working with just recently, which is to write really dense, very detailed Alan Moore scale style scripts, page by page, panel by panel descriptions, notes about narrative stuff, what character stuff we're doing. So we'll write a full script. So Ethan and I spent the first 2 years on Metal Arc writing, being in a room, running dialogue past each other, coming up with plot points, going out to lunch and yelling at each other over our laptops, and just kind of building and playing and growing. And Metal Arc's different from our usual way of working, and certainly mine, which is that it's a crime story, and crime stories are a TikTok. They're a watch that you really have to build. And so there's a plot mechanism that has to be established and worked out, because the kind of, the tumblers all need to kind of line up and hit this result to service just the inherent architecture of that genre. And that's new for us. We are both kind of more character and emotional writers. And so it was really interesting to have to build and the kind of engineer the structure and the architecture of a story and narrative plot points, and then realize that after we've done all that, we can drape and hang and just completely indulge in the kind of emotional landscape, the arguments that the father and the son have with each other that can be pulled almost directly from dialogue that both of us were having with our own boys at the time. It was really a marvelous lesson in that fences make for freedoms kind of thing. You get this kind of established, I think there is an erroneous presumption that structure confines your creativity, but it actually, I think, when you have all of your architecture and your landscape laid out, you're then free to run with it. And as long as you make sure that you kind of hit those points along the way so people don't get lost in your own like indulgence with what you're drawing or how you're making stuff, it works. It invites more time. So as much as it was scripted out as we started going through and making the book, and once we got down to the art making, then it really befalls mostly onto me. And Ethan has to kind of sit back and be a kind of a angel and devil on my shoulders while we work, and he'll be off working on set, and I'll do 5 or 6 pages or do a scene and then email it out to him, and then he and I will go back and forth on those things while he's working and while I'm working on this. And it creates a lot of change. I mean, just like any film, the script isn't the movie any more than the script for a graphic novel is the final product. So the art making started to invite this whole other mythic level in, the idea of animals and being in a world and telling a story that felt mythic but wasn't um, leaning on the kind of old tropes that we find when we think of myth. We think everybody's got to wear like, cloth diapers and have spears and fight giant cyclopses and hydra-headed things. And those were the images and symbols of their time period. But these days, telling a myth in a time of, you know, old gasoline cars and suburban sprawl and strip malls, it starts to have different clothing onto it, and finding that clothing and finding how myth would present itself in a mundane, poor Texas town was really fun for us. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't happen until you start to work with it visually, and the book starts to kind of tell you what it is, starts to describe itself to you. And I think about halfway through, we were more passengers along while the characters in the story were telling us how to speak to each other, and the story itself was guiding us. And I think a lot of that was able to happen because we had created this really deft skeletal structure with this very detailed plot of events, most of which gets buried. All the backstory, the characters all have these enormous backstories. We spent a long time getting a lot of really amazing stuff from this prison guard, the Supermax prison, about potential breakout, how that works, how the prison functions, what you can, what you can't do. All that stuff kind of goes in, you kind of build it into it, and then you kind of hide it and tell your story. And in that way, it's really unmatched. I think even him, who's done a lot of, Ethan's done a lot of film, a lot of theater, and it still is of such a deeper, bigger level than even that, I think, has been in his experience. And it always surprises me as a medium. So it is a true delight to come back and do a poster after something like that. I mean, it is like heaven. So having been so burned out from Meadowlark this last time, it has been so great to come back and to kind of bring that stuff in a way that's different, because you've got a film generally. Even if I'm doing stuff for films that haven't come out, which is why I can't really speak to a lot of what I'm doing now, there is a product there that you can kind of see. And so there is that architecture, there is that kind of tangibility to respond to, and it becomes interpretive. I mean, poster work is really the same thing as book cover work. You're basically creating an advertisement to try to lure people to buy what's inside of it and take it in. So a poster has to reflect the film that you're doing. It has to celebrate it. It has to kind of tickle without overindulging. It's an appetizer, at best, because the film is really what you're trying to get people to go see. Even if it's an old film and we all are familiar with it, and I know a lot of the poster community spent a lot of time with, older properties or stuff that we've worn so many times over and over again. There's still a job to kind of tease, tickle, and kind of interest. And I think the best thing that you could do when you do a poster right is it makes people want to see that movie again and again and again. So that's always a very similar kind of goal to how we work and tell our stories and kind of bring it together. So it's an interesting thing to be at the tip of a spear when you've got a film like Parasite and no one's seen it yet, but your poster is the first thing they see, or Midsummer, or any of the other things I've been doing. It's incredible to see how it's a lot of responsibility to be the front person for delivering that first take on something, but it's kind of marvelous to hear that it made people go see the film, which is always the thing that you want to end up with. It's just like, if making a book is about really getting people interested in making their own books and telling their own stories, the same way that me reading Ray Bradbury and Frank Herbert when I was a kid made me want to tell stories. So it's all part of that kind of continuum. It's terrific. It's really hard to overly complain about it, except for comics, which will eat your soul. But
you talked just then about obviously you've done posters for films that have been around for a long time, and you do posters for some stuff where you're sort of combining this culture of alternative movie posters with the film coming out, and during some of the sessions that we've had at AMPjam 2021, we've had this sort of discussion about where you've got a sort of, okay, so movie posters in the movie theater are they are there to sell the movie, but then when you've got in alternative movie posters, often you've got a poster that's there to sort of almost sell itself. Do you know what I mean? It's there as a piece of art to, you know, the material that it's referencing is already known by the audience, it's much loved, and it's like, can the artist bring an interpretation of that movie that is different in a way that I want, that, you know, someone wants to own it. Do you recognize when you're doing that, when do you have a different approach when you're doing something that is new to this, something that is for a project, a movie that is new, to when it's something that's existed for however long?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that I do. I mean, I think when you do an alternative movie poster, or say like I'll do like a poster for Boyhood, which has been out, you know, for years and years and years. You're creating, and there's been other great posters and stuff for it. You're creating a memento that people can have to take home. It's different then. You're not really selling a film like you are when you're doing something that hasn't been released yet or is fresh out of the gate, and you're part of the buzz to get people to see it in theaters or streaming or however the hell we're supposed to watch these things now. The approach is always the same, and I think the Criterion work that I've been doing for, I think I've done 8 or 9 things with them at this point. It's always the same thing. The nice thing about the Criterion thing is the ability to do a bunch of different stuff. So with a Mondo poster, you got to kind of get it all in one image, and that is such a challenge. And it's similar to, say, doing a cover for Criterion, but then whatever itch I don't get to scratch in the cover, I can find by doing the other half dozen pieces of artwork that they'll put inside the booklet or put on the menu screen or on the disc. And Eric Skillman over there is such a mad genius about being able to take any of my overworking, and I always way overwork for everything, that there's always so many more extra pieces that end up getting used and cut in, and bringing that together gives you a little bit of places for your ideas to bleed off. Whereas with doing something, say, like for, well, I did Midsummer, I think it was just coming out, so that's not a good example. Or Hereditary, let's say. Hereditary had been out for about a year when I got to do that poster. It was known at that point, and my job at that point then is to create a memento for it, to kind of surf the enthusiasm for that film. Sure, some of it is to bring new people into it, and certainly that happens, but I think the approach is always kind of the same. You're there to distill, to take something, and I always try to find something weird that's a different take on the standard approach. There's certain things where you're watching a movie and you go, that's, you know, if you're going to do The Matrix, you got to do Neo or like dodging bullets, right? You know, so I would always my first approach is to always look at what, you know, the most obvious ones to do. And if you get the benefit of doing a poster for something that has been done a lot already or has had its life, then the imagery is there to push against. So I know, like, I don't want to do that. Like, I had done something, a commission for Alien, and we're turning that into a poster, and it's weird and different. And there's been 1,000 Alien posters, and it's very easy to fall into the tropes of fulfilling what everybody says they always want. And believe me, people get mad when you don't do that, strangely. But for the most part, there is a desire, at least from my standpoint, to show a different side of something as much as possible. When I'm doing a film, like right now, I'm trying to talk about things without talking about them. For something that's coming out, you're working directly for the studio. So with something like My Octopus Teacher that I did for Netflix, or Parasite, for Neon, and with Bong and Memories of a Murder for Him, it was they do want you to do there are certain things they want you to tick through. There's a lot more pressure to deliver a more accurate, less super weird left turn take on Parasite because it's being used to sell the movie to an American audience for the first time. But for Memories of Murder, which most people maybe hadn't seen until they reissued it, it's still, many years old property. And so there's more freedom to do weird things with it. So instead of doing the usual portraiture thing, I was able to do, a big field of grass with a bound hand, hidden and nestled in the bushes, just something a little bit odder and a little bit more ridiculous than you would normally do and approach it. I think I can say this. If I'm not, I'll be screwed later. I am doing something for this marvelous French film that won the Palme d'Or to Tame, that Neon is bringing over here to the States as well. It is such a challenge to do because it is such a bizarre and weird and lovely and sweet and violent and crazy, crazy film. And again, even though we're doing two, it's a little bit like Ende. We're having to just slash and burn and pick one tiny thing to represent that doesn't make it overly crowded. And I'm not a big fan of head clouds. 1,000 act when you have these big ensembles that you see, and there's like 1,000 actors' heads in a big blob. It is one of my greatest pet peeves. Or these hyper overwrought, super compositionally insane kind of toy box thrown on the ground kind of image things. I really like really getting down to a kind of a singular point or a couple or an idea or two, and then really trying to grow that seed from that perspective. So in that way, I make the job harder and more difficult in that way. But I think for me at least, the satisfaction or the result is a little bit more impactful. To take a weird relationship or to take a moment that maybe isn't the kind of bleeding edge of what you might think it would be. If I was doing a Jaws thing, to do something that is more about getting to the psyche of the Roy Scheider character and his relationship with his terror of the water, rather than constantly have, a sexy bikini lady on a kickboard getting chased by a shark, which is kind of Jaws and kind of the thing you do. So pushing against type, I just think makes more interesting work. So I try to do that as much as possible.
Cool. That sort of brings us on to the topic that's sort of a key theme of AMPjam 2021, which is composition. And right. I think you have. I think you take. It seems from where I'm sitting, that you have a few different approaches, because sometimes you pick something very, sometimes you'll have a very I say simple image, but it's only simple in its contrast to something like Twin Peaks, where you're layering images over each other and you're doing something quite abstract. And I just wondered if you could talk about the way that you approach composition. And you may see that you have different approaches. You may see it's all one thing that I'm sure you'll tell us. But also how you go about things from the beginning. Because I just want to add to that question. One of the things that I find very fascinating about your output is your recursive stuff, because once as far as I'm aware, it's one touch and that's it. Is that right? So
yeah, unbroken
when you're
line,
planning out, so there's no unbroken line. So composition must be. I'm fascinated to hear how you sort of nail composition when you're doing something like that, where it's like once you've started, you're off and that's it, and it ends how it ends, sort of.
Right.
But so
it's a lot. I think composition is hugely important. It's one of the first things that we learn when we're being trained as artists. And I went to an art high school and I went to Pratt. I ended up doing almost none of the things I was trained to do while I was doing those things. But there was the idea of composition has always been singularly important, I think, to that work. And when I'm coming from book cover work, where there is, I mean, there always is a kind of a standard title, authors, there's a breakdown. I mean, there you can see that there's a thing, even in ones that I design, I kind of stick to those things. You can break out of those molds to a certain degree, but they do create parameters to work with, which can be a little bit constricting and confining a lot. They come from practical places. We used to get yelled at in comics a lot whenever we wanted to have like the title at the bottom, because they go into these rats and the bottom part gets kind of blocked off, and people can't see the title of the thing, and the kind of marketing side of those publishers feel like if you can't see the title of the thing, then you're not going to know what it is, you're not going to buy it. I, of course, don't agree with that. I think that if you see Luke Skywalker, you're looking at Star Wars. I don't think you need to also then be told you're looking at, this is Luke Skywalker, and by the way, this is Star Wars. I mean, there's certain things that are familiar enough where you can kind of then push away from those crutches to a certain degree. But for the most part, I like to compose based with the movie poster thing. I think, especially with the Mondo stuff, we're kind of free to kind of go nuts, turn it on its side and do a landscape, or Rob Jones over there, or Eric Garza, or Mo, or anybody that helps work with the design. There's always this willingness and interest to kind of integrate the title into the drawing, or to have it be it's some weird angle or some inversion, or have it hidden someplace. It's such a wonderful landscape, and it's so free that I'm free to sit down with the composition and just do what feels good. If it's like I'm doing something for Bullet, I want those cars rushing, and I want this sense of motion and action and guns and crime. And if it's something for like Jen Kent's The Nightingale, it's a character piece. It's about loss and revenge, and it's all about one person. It's all about this one moment and this one directive. So there's a quietness there that's different. And I think a lot of times the composition is born out of getting inside the subject and finding a way that makes it look interesting and dynamic. And I think I know that I'm a huge kind of portraiture addict, as I'm sure you can see from a lot of the work I do. If you've ever just leave me to do a portrait, I will absolutely always defer to that, because I think there's something endlessly marvelous about seeing faces. But at the same time, a lot of these projects, either there's difficulty with not in executing a likeness, but in terms of the approval process. Sometimes I'll get a job where you are asked to do a poster for a film, but you're not allowed to show any of the actors' faces in the thing, which can seem insane. And it's a fun set of new strictures that to bounce around. And it's in those moments where composition becomes a way to tell that story, or to elucidate the film in a way that is particular to the film without leaning on a character's likeness, to a certain degree. And I always kind of love and indulge in those things. For something like Gunpowder Milkshake, for instance, we had, it's an ensemble cast. There's a lot of actors in there, and they're all really big name people. And there was sometimes you get strictures from their managers where they're contractually obligated to have all of their heads be the same size on a certain piece of paper, which compositionally is death to a lot of ways. To have that flatness to lock that depth. And Gunpowder was similar in that way, but it was a really fun challenge in order to be able to still get a sense of space to express an action, but also have those restrictions be honored as well. And to find a way to kind of sneak through the laws to not technically commit a crime and get rejected while you're doing it, but to kind of stick a landing when you're not supposed to do certain things and still make it work in ways that a lot of times these strictures don't really regard. They're not really thinking about, this is going to be a bummer for the artist. if all the heads have to be the same, because they're thinking about the representation of their client, which is their job, and I totally respect that. But you're kind of left with having to obey laws that run counter to your job when you're doing this work. And I like to see those kinds of things as places where inspiration can grow up around, or they can inspire. And a lot of times those kind of proclamations can kind of kick me off what might be a default solve or my usual way of dealing with something. And I'm always grateful for that. With something like Midsummer, we spent a lot of time. I must have done 20 different concepts for that poster. I would say 15 of them revolved around the main actress in some ways, and flowers, which of course is what you see most of the time with that. And so being able to do something totally different with that, to have that upside down bear and have that kind of garden bursting out from its carcass there, was, I think, only at Mondo to be able to submit a weird idea like that. And I think that was the last of all of the string of concepts that I put forward. And I said, also, here's this weird thing that I really love. For them to cheerlead and encourage taking up something really bizarre like that is what makes them so fun to work with. But it creates a really interesting challenge to yourself for the next one, because you're not always that free to do it. Ari has a really wild imagination and is really open about different approaches to how his work gets visualized. It is still a pinching me in the arm miracle that Twin Peaks worked, because David he is an artist and a painter himself, and has such a very specific vision about how things are representative of his work, and tends to reject almost any other artist's interpretation of what he's doing. And I think that's a truth that you see with a lot of auteurs that don't, like at Criterion, want to see anybody drawing anything for them. They want stills from their films on their covers, no matter how much Criterion might want to create art for it that's different. It's something that I, as a person who does write and create his own material and books, I totally get that kind of need to protect the kingdom. But it's a marvelous endorsement when someone like David is able to look at all of these weird, completely Greg-specific interpretations of Lynch's stories and Mark Frost themes and ideas, and to be able to endorse it was a real affirmation to constantly try to push the weird margins of things as much as possible. But it doesn't always work. Not every story, not every film is a weird thing. I like weird stuff, but I also love doing something like Boyhood is not a weird movie. It's not psychedelic, or it's not threatening. It really is a chronicle of a boy's life. And the one thing that I remember getting affirmed when I was starting to work on that, and I know Rick a bit, and of course Ethan really very well, so I have a secret backdoor way to kind of talk with them about what I'm doing, which I'm sure can be very perplexing and difficult on the producer side of this. The publishers don't always like it when you kind of powwow with the creators on things, but they were so instrumental in helping me affirm. I immediately went into that one thinking, whatever we do, it cannot be about how this film was made, which is really pretty much what almost everyone talks about. Oh, it took 12 years and you shot a little bit every year. The kind of shtick of the making of the film often overtakes conversations about what the film is about. And I felt like I didn't want to do that. And I was worried that it might be weird. And it was such a delight for Rick to be like, oh my God, please don't do that. Because if I think he said, anytime that someone is paying attention to how you made the thing rather than the thing you've made, you've failed. They're looking at the wrong thing, and it's heartbreaking and it drives them crazy. And it became a point of permission to really develop something else, to do something, to ignore that kind of very brilliant and very cool way that film was made, and then to talk about the story and the narrative is much more in my wheelhouse of interest, generally speaking, than, trying to show him, try to show Eller age throughout the years, which is great. I love the Criterion saw for that on their cover of all those like phone booth shots of them kind of growing up. It's great. It makes sense. It's growing up is what it's about. So it's not wrong to do that way, but there's a different way always to talk about a thing, and finding that, I think, is the job that we're supposed to do. We're supposed to find the thing that is new and unique as a way to kind of approach showing it in a way that works. And the composition becomes a tool for showcasing that, pinpointing that, celebrating that moment. I think it's so important. I think composition, even if you're doing a singular head in the middle of a page, it's got to have a reason and a purpose to be that way. You've got to have answers for those questions. And even if you aren't going to have to verbalize those answers, the lack of having one shows up in the art. And if you don't have it there, you'll feel its lack. There'll be something kind of flatter about it. It's a lot like Wild on Meadowlark, while we put so much backstory into these characters that almost none of it actually makes it onto the physical page. It's all there. It shows up in how they relate to each other. It answers questions and makes it feel natural for when they're arguing and why they're having different ideas about how they see each other, or how they respond to a particular event, or how they solve a problem. It's there for the reader, even if they're not reading it, because it's there in the way they're drawn and the way they relate. It seems naturalistic. So when you see a film where there's that much work into it, or somebody like David Fincher will just overshoot like by tens of thousands of hours of footage, what you end up with in the end is benefited by all of that information that he's gathered and put together, and that's what makes his film so dense and feels so rich and tangible and real. It makes the cops in those murder scenes in Seven feel like you're really in a room there, which I understand really smelled really bad in those places, and it was really hard to be on those sets. That shows up, in their performances. It's all the unspoken stuff where I think there's so much value. And for our job in the poster thing, it all has to be kind of pushed down to one tiny moment that you put on a poster, and that also is, 24 by 36 is big. It takes up a lot of space, and I'm constantly thinking about how that thing relates in a room with someone being in a room with it. And do you want to be in that space? Do you, like for something like I did for Psycho, having this giant skull, this huge giant skull head with this wig on it, it's a creepy image. And does everybody want to have that in their house? Probably not, but it does work as a way to express the story in a way that is different. It doesn't show the shower scene, which we see a million times, or it doesn't have Norman Bates looking sinister and sweet at the same time, which we've also seen. Again, it's always those things. It's trying to pay attention to something that's commonly referred to as the dog that didn't bark, as a way to find an answer to something. There's information in that silence, and there's a lot of stuff that isn't tread on. And I think when you're doing posters that are from subjects that have been done so many times, like, how many Jurassic Park posters do we have already, and how many more do we need? And it seems like we'll never stop making them. But there's still, I feel like, and not that I'm looking to do a Jurassic Park poster, but
I'd buy it.
the job in that. What's that?
I'd buy it. I'd love to see you draw dinosaurs.
That would be so hard. It would be so hard to do. Like, how do you draw a Jurassic Park poster that isn't like every Jurassic Park poster, which is mine so much of what that film is? I like the hellish challenge of that. I've had to do posters and LPs for films by which they would not send me the screener because security was so terrified. So you have it's not pleasant, and I certainly don't enjoy that. But there is something fun with someone hog tying your legs to your arm, and then asking you to run to this burning house and rescue this family with your one arm and your torso, and figuring out how to make that work. I don't know. Maybe it's comics made me into a psychopath, but there's something kind of interesting about having to pull off an impossible task in that. I feel like I
Sure.
answered like 6 questions at once.
I know. This it. I know. Well, it's clearly it's a hive of like. There's some really interesting ideas that you're putting forward there. We had planned to go through these different posters. I think maybe I'll pick a couple in the order that we put them in, so that just to be kind to Key, who's doing tech. So if we because Sacred Deer is a poster that I mean I can clearly see where you got some of the inspiration from, given what you've got behind you. But given that we're talking about composition and stuff, and it's a very striking poster. There's it's, and given that it's 24 by 36, but the main image is very much within it with a large border and stuff, and that negative space. It would be great to hear sort of what your process was with that, and how you arrived at that idea, and obviously a very striking poster and a very popular one within the community. So yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about Sacred Deer.
I think that film hadn't come out yet. I was really familiar with The Lobster, so I had a sense of how Yorgos makes and comfortably in the zone of true weirdness. And Sacred Deer is an incredibly dark kind of revenge puzzle of a film, and with these amazing performances. I don't think I've seen Nicole Kidman do that kind of level work since The Others and before. I mean, just remarkable work. I loved everybody in that. So a lot of the original sketches, if I remember right, were like pictures of the father like head mounted on a rat, with deer hooves holding the rifle. There's all sorts of ways of using the kind of I mean, there's no deer in the movie, despite its title. It's a thematic device, or it's a symbol. And for the poster, I actually put a literal one in there because, again, it was the thing that wasn't. It's not there. It's a way of like kind of literalizing the symbol in a certain way, with the cloth over the head. There's something very spooky about that. And it's one of my favorite moments in the piano, which is one of the least piano moments, is when at the end she's got this black cloth over her face because she feels so embarrassed trying to learn how to speak for the first time in many years. And Harvey Keitel kind of comes over to her while she's walking around going, bah, 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 and kind of grabs her and kind of kisses her through that weird veil. There's something really lovely there, but there's something really disturbed and weird about it too. And so the idea of hiding a face when you're doing a portrait is interesting, I think, for that reason. One of the things that struck me with Sacred Deer was really the kind of Museum of Natural History display case of the kind of specimen quality and the kind of being in a box, being in an environment where you're kind of trapped in. And I remember as a kid feeling like going through those things, like they can't get out. There's this fake illusion of freedom. There's a landscape behind them, and there's this very realistic kind of setting there, but there's a wall with a doorknob on it, like there's no, it's a little that Truman Show thing where you kind of run your boat up against the sky a little bit and then climb the stairs and go through a door and leave it. It's a kind of a surreal trap that's there. And the film feels like that. And so being able to do something that strange to avoid, again, Mondo was able to, out of all those sketches of all those actors that I had done, and a lot of them were like with claws over their heads and guns, and for them to say, yeah, we really like this weird deer thing that you did that doesn't show any of these superstar actors that you've got in this movie, seems so counterintuitive to what you're supposed to do, was fantastic. And I think it was that ability to do something that was unexpected for a movie that is in and of itself completely unexpected in how it rolls out is a real gift, I think. And I think a lot of it came from that ability to kind of think differently. A weird movie gives you permission to be weird.
There's the idea that you've got. We'll go on to another post in a sec. But the idea that you've got that case, which is that the object within it is for presentation. It's to be seen, but there's this the face of this animal is obscured. That sort of cognitive dissonance in the message gives this sort of amazing that's part of the unease for me when I look at it. It's like I'm meant
Mm.
to be. This is something I'm meant to be looking at, and I can't see it.
Right. It makes you
Yeah.
want to look more. When you have a question, I think you tend to dig more. It's why I refer to like book covers as a tease. If you want to capture somebody from across the room and get them to come closer to it. And then when they get there, you want to reward them again with detail and information that they couldn't see from a distance. But you never want to spoil them for wanting to grab the book, go to the counter and buy it. You want to keep them kind of curious to want to dig more. And I think in general for art, I've always loved the art that the more you look at it, the more you need to find out about it, the more questions that aren't answered that you want to get from it. It's what allows, beyond just admiring the technical ability of a Van Gogh painting, to stand in front of it for hours and hours, to see the story that's behind it, to find out what it means, and to discover all these little secrets. I think that's the thing I'm always kind of trying to do. And with something like Sacred Deer, there's an opportunity to, through being strange and unusual, or with Twin Peaks, through that really odd, very, very orchestrated language, to be able to kind of tell different stories or point to different themes that don't answer those themes, but ask enough of a question to at least lie about whether or not there's an answer there for you if you look at it. So getting into that nervous middle, that's I love that stuff. And I love Sacred Deer, that poster still. And I usually very much dislike my own work. That one I still really like a lot. I think I actually have it hanging up downstairs, which is weird for me, but yeah, I love that.
Well, that's some great explanations there. I wonder if because we've touched on Twin Peaks quite a bit, if we just look at Ad Astra, because I think that poster, given your body of work thus far that we've seen thus far in movie posters, that because we're used to seeing portraits and very detailed images, obviously you've got these two characters, but you're telling a story through a lot of negative space there and so on.
Yeah.
And it would just be great to hear a little bit about why you went with that approach, because it feels like something that's quite different in your sort of portfolio, should we say?
Sure. Oh, sure. Yeah, no, that was another film that hadn't come out yet when I was hired to do that. I think the studio got in touch with Mondo to kind of coordinate, which is happening a lot more and more, which to my great delight. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what else. It's one of those things where once we solved the image, I don't know if I really remember a lot of the other ways that we had going to it. That movie is so much a portrait about Brad Pitt's character, and the theme. It's a father and son story. I mean, his father is this kind of horrible asshat of a man. He's terrible as a father, just absolutely terrible. And it begins on the heels of this guy who's failing at his relationship with his wife and feeling kind of lost and unmoored by it, which all fits into the space thing that you get going on, the idea of distance, of emotional distance, of meaning that is coming from without as opposed to finding some within. And the conclusion of that film, of him coming to understand the value of the small things of intimacy, of the vastness of intimacy versus it being small and petty as his father might see it, of that kind of relationship. He's constantly reaching out to his father and getting kind of batted away or ignored. And so having an image where they're both in their kind of, the kind of anti-self suits, where you're not seeing their faces, I think was a really interesting challenge. I think I remember in the brief, we weren't allowed to show Brad Pitt, his face, and so much I love a lot of these kind of shots of him and his helmet. And there's so much, he's so emotive in that film. And it seemed at first to be a real blow to being able to express the emotional content of the film without being able to show how that emotion is expressed through a human face or his character's face. But it turned out, by simplifying things down to a certain way, the constant sense of distance and space and emptiness of, I mean, there's this quiet moment where he has to let go of his father. They're way out on the far reaches of the solar system. There's no one else for millions and millions of miles. It's just those two, and he has to let him go. I mean, it's such a crazy thing to have that moment of release, of encouraging a lack of contact, and then to be truly alone there, and then to have to travel back all alone. Is there's I think once those, after seeing the film a bunch of times, that really struck me, and it suddenly became really obvious that this source of pain is this resonating, because his father has done something that is causing this catastrophic pulsing that is just absolutely annihilating life on Earth and the ability for it to sustain itself. And in the very nascent kind of pre-expanse time of moving out and having colonies on Mars and the Moon, and the idea that this kind of broken heart kind of beating its pain out and ruining everyone's lives over and over again from a place of isolation and emptiness, again, is that same theme again. It's, the heartbreak and the connective heartbreak shows up in the catastrophic destruction that it brings to all the billions of people on Earth. There's so much of that scale of big and small. So being able to show a small moment in a vast space, it became very easy at that point to do that. And I wouldn't have gotten through it unless I had gotten access to see the screener. And I always sit down with it and I watch the movie all the way through without really doing anything but paying attention to the film. And then I'll sit down and I'll watch it again with a notebook and start making, timestamp, like this is an interesting moment, or this has a visual cue, or that object might be fun to draw, or whatever. And I'll make a list of all these little timestamp moments and ideas that it's giving me or sparking in my head. And then I'll sit down with the film again and start going through it after the puzzle's been built, and shatter the pieces and start studying the pieces and putting them back together again over and over again. So by the time I'm done with any of these things, I've seen this movie inside and out, macro and micro, maybe 7 or 8 times. So there's such an intimate knowledge with the stuff that maybe you missed the first time you see it. That theme of distance, the theme of heartbreak, the theme of intimacy that's really pervasive there gets lost when they're fighting an angry space baboon. So it's being able to have access to really dig in deep and really pull up all the firmament, find the taproot. I think it really lends itself to then almost inadvertently telling something unique, because there's a language there that, if I can speak to it, will seem unusual and novel in terms of its approach than just a big picture of Brad Pitt with a space helmet on, and that we know that it's a space thing.
It's stunning that you said about when you said micro, because I was literally going to say in my next sentence, I'm going to say micro and macro, because it's that kind of film. And then you said micro and macro, and I was like, whoa. It is very much because it's a grandiose story, but then it's there's that father and son aspect.
It's a very small film.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. I love that movie so much. It's such a beautiful little kind of love letter to self in a lot of ways, and an affirmation for connection. In a film that's about being disconnected. Yeah, I love it. It's terrific.
Yeah, it's a hell of a movie. The In the Mood for Love, I found that as quite a different. It feels like a different style to you. I think you're using some different tools.
Yes.
And having had the conversations during the convention, we're talking about sort of inspirations and stuff, and I saw what seemed like a little bit of David Downton going on. And I don't know if that was a, or perhaps it was someone who influenced him. I don't know, but it would be great to see why the sort of, well, not necessarily I suppose some of your inspirations in general would be good to hear. But if and obviously you've talked about people like Alan Moore. But in terms of artists, but yeah, in terms of your, say, the difference in visual style. I don't know how else to express it, but it's
right.
Going from something
that was a real Hail Mary moment. So In the Mood for Love was coming up on a big anniversary, and there was tons of us all over the planet that were being asked to do different varieties. There was different DVD studios, different soundtrack studios in different countries, and they were all doing art to celebrate this big anniversary that was coming around. And I think we were on the tail end of that day that was happening. And so by the time I sat down, and I had done this whole raft of my usual kind of graphite, really detailed hyper likeness, because I love the relationship between the kind of constantly missed ships in the night kind of quality that this film has. And I remember Wong felt like, I don't like this. I've seen, because he'd been digesting so many of the other things, and a lot of them were the same classic, like giant red colored, the same image of her at the window, of him looking out from behind in different moods and different kind of setups. And I think that he had just become so exhausted by the kind of typical way in which that film has always been expressed. By the time he got to us, he was just like, I've had enough. I reject all this work. And I felt we were really, I thought we were done. We all felt like, oh, this looks great. We're really excited. They're going to be really thrilled with this. And it was a bit of a shock when it was turned down, but it created a sense of, I don't know what else we're going to do. I think Mondo felt like it's fine. We might just pass on this. And I remember thinking like, no, let me give me a day. Let me see if I can come up with something to solve it to a certain degree. And I went back to a style that I'd used when I had done this children's book with President Obama, celebrating his first inaugural address. And that one was done with a Sumi ink brush, and a lot of these giant Winsor Newton kind of oil stick. They're like giant kind of oil paint pastels, kind of scribbled and light and color and explosive kind of design stuff going on. And so I went back to the studio, woke up at the crack of dawn, ran over here, and then just started kind of doing some drawings and then throwing all these different kind of wild swaths on there to make it much more reduced in terms of the specificities of the place. I mean, we were getting notes on like the rice cooker that he's holding in some of my drawings. So we just kind of threw everything away and just went back to the kind of taproot of what that film is, which is this man and this woman who love each other, but never come together in a way that they want or should. So to be able to get to that, to get singular, and then to just make it about a kind of a nice kind of Bernie Fuchs, old 1960s period kind of design aesthetic. I mean, I remember I got a couple of these old books that are just old design, old 1960s poster books or graphic design books from the 50s, or, J.C. Leyendecker, or all these old guys that I always go to when I get lost, to come up with a new way to kind of show it, to push against whatever it is that he was responding to that he didn't like, seemed to kind of break the back of it. And once we presented those, it was solved. And then we did some little tweakings to get likenesses exactly the way that we wanted. But for the most part, it was that kind of Hail Mary pass of that project that saved it. And the willingness and the ability to go, to kind of take everything that you've been doing and flush it, to also take all the frustration of having all that work rejected summarily and lost, and feeling like, oh, I put everything I had into all that work. How in the world could I do it twice? It was affirming in that theory that I always had, that there's never just one solution to a particular problem, which is why there are 6 billion Jurassic Park posters. There's always a new way to look at something. There's always a new way to tell the Jaws story, it seems. And I find that really interesting. And I love that having that moment to be able to kind of teach that. And we ended up making a very different poster that was very unusual for what, certainly nothing like what we were going to set out to do. And it's one of my favorite things still to this day, as a result. It was just, sometimes it's better when you're not thinking about it too much. And it just becomes like a panicked scramble to solve. You end up kind of inadvertently doing something better than if you sat around and considered it all so much,
I
and
definitely
overthink things.
when you're given it. I love a deadline, and I love pressure. It forces you to make decisions. It's like you've spent 2 weeks going, do I do this or do I do that? And then you've got 2 hours, and you're like, well, I'm doing this because if I don't do this, then it doesn't get done. So this is the only option. So we're going to go with this and see how good we can get it.
Sure.
So I think we'll talk about your last piece, The Electric Ant, in a second. If we just cover Boyhood just briefly, because it is your latest Mondo poster, and people have seen it, and it came out. It was revealed last week. And obviously, you say about your connection to that you have a bit of an in there in terms of the source material. But yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about your sort of approach with that poster.
Sure. We had gone through a lot. I had written. I've got to run soon, but we had written. I put up an article on Muddy Colors that kind of goes through and actually has some of the sketches and stuff. I had completely different concepts in mind for this with Boyhood, of really focusing in on Eller as an older guy. It felt like this is the pinnacle, the end of the movie when he's out at Big Bend. It's that moment where he's leaving his childhood finally behind, which is what we spent the whole movie witnessing. All the screwed up, crappy, drunk dads, stepdads that his mom kept marrying, and the immature, feckless dad that he was stuck with, that was his actual dad, and the heartbreak that it constantly brought him. It felt like coming to show a portrait of all that broken boyhood becoming this new man that he was the way to go, which is not is not what we ended up doing for the poster at the end. I did about 6 or 7 that I really liked, and one that I really loved. But it wasn't until we went back to, there's this wonderful moment, and I grew up down there as well. And I love Rick's films because there's so much familiarity in the biography that I have with Texas, my relationship. He's so good about those details. And one of the things in these suburban sprawls is these little alleyways, these little dead spaces in between these houses that have fences there. And it's usually where like the shitty old gutter goes, or your broken truck gets lost, and all the stuff and the detritus from your life is kind of thrown there because it's out of sight, out of mind. Maybe you can hide it behind some bushes, and then nobody bothers to do anything about it. And it's in those weird little spots when I was growing up in my suburban neighborhood in Houston, that's where I put my fort. Like that's where I like hid my Playboy magazines underneath the bricks there, and kind of, stole my dad's beer and put there. So to be able to do that, to kind of find that moment. There's this great moment in the movie where the little boy goes and he, after he was looking at some stolen Playboys with his friend, kind of goes back there and he kind of has his own private moment. And for me, that is where the incubus of yourself is. For me, it was. It's the hidden away place that you kind of retreat to kind of go and engage with yourself in a way that doesn't have anything to do with the shitty world that you're living in, or the bad parents that you might have, or the friends that you don't seem to connect with, or the town you don't get along with. To go and kind of slowly start to build and play with your own sense of who you are and who you want to be, to kind of do that, and to be able to sneak all those little details of his life in there. The car that he felt like he was going, that his father promised that he would give him, that amazing muscle car that he used to drive, that he ends up selling because his wife wanted him to get a van, for the kids. And how his father just completely never understood why that was such a devastation to him as an inheritance that was denied. So those car keys being there, the blue pickup truck that he ends up driving away with at the end, the broken pieces of the home that he was there, the plate that's shattered on the ground that his stepmother threw at his face when he didn't like the peas that were served him, all this stuff, these little snapshot memories that we have as children, growing up, that then become the kind of biography that we build for ourselves as adults. It was just perfect for that. And I think that's when we all agree, like, this is that moment, that singular moment. I was also still in the throes of Meadowlark. I mean, I'd done that piece maybe more than a year ago. So I was still wrapping up on my own story with Ethan about our childhoods and being fathers, and that kind of struggle. It was just such a perfect time. It was right where I was. So there's a lot of kind of cross pollination going on there for sure.
So we've got a few questions, but I think we could do like some quick rapid. We'll do them as like rapid
Yeah,
fire
let's bang
answers
them out
because I
real
know
quick.
that you've got it. Because I know that you've got to go.
Yep.
So Stephen Reed has said so from his perspective that the replication of your artwork has gotten better over the years. Do you have an involvement with the printing process, or more so than you did to begin with, or?
My involvement is to trust good printers. You know, it's been great. It's great to go through Mondo. They put in great. I mean, DNL does amazing work. John Smith has been for years with me an absolute wizard at interpreting my insane, weird way of working and being able to reproduce it in a way. I think it was back when I did the 2001 poster. I was floored by how identical it was to the piece that I'd done, which was filled with all of these subtle colors and these gradients and these very gossamer details. And it just that they were able to capture that and to reproduce it still blows my mind. And there's a couple of things that I'm doing now that will be coming out soon. One of which it'll be the worst thing I've ever done to John, to make him have to separate this thing. There are so many colors in it. It is so insane, and it is so unlike anything I've ever done before. I pity them for having to make that work. And so far, none of them have ever felt like there was anything but like, no, let's make this challenge. It's the same kind of passion for the work that really, I think, makes the good work. So if you can get good people that can do their jobs well for you, that's the biggest asset you can. So I stay out of their hair. They're much smarter at it than I am.
Awesome. We got Guillaume says he loves basically your portraits, and including the what you were doing with Game of Thrones. Would you revisit for a Game of Thrones poster, or are you still so traumatized?
I very much no.
By the final.
Yeah, that red wedding, right? No, I just saw that with my youngest. That whole series, he's in love with it now. He's old enough to deal with the rape and violence of that show. But yeah, I approached, and Mondo really tried to make a series. We thought we might do a series like we had done with Twin Peaks for all those portraits, but Game of Thrones was just wrapping up. All the actors were scattering. We were going to need to individually track down likeness rights, and it was one of these things where it was just going to be almost impossible to get the approval process through to make that work, which was different in a lot of ways from Twin Peaks because of the contracts that were signed. David and Mark were really the final word on things. So having one single point to be the solve for those approvals can really be the thing that makes something work or makes it, like in Game of Thrones, that lack of a central place to do it fall apart to a certain degree. And HBO they might be able to have the rights to approve of some of the basic themology stuff, but since they were portraits, it was just going to be too impossible to do it. And so a lot of times these projects can die on the vine or never get born because there's some background mechanical disconnect, or there's some issue with this actor is fighting with this studio and you get caught in the middle of it. There's always some little thing that's happening that can absolutely devastate it and make it not work. And sometimes just the sheer mechanics of it are impossible to do. I know it's impossible to get a bullet poster made because it's really difficult to deal with the actor's estate for his likeness. And then apparently the Ford company has very difficult relationships with approving the car. So there's a lot of stuff that sometimes you run up against that seems funny to us on the outside that are real headwinds that kill things. And I think I don't know that we're going to be able to do something like that. And I won't make a poster.
Make a promise. If I just combine these two questions from Alice and Philip. So one is basically that what made you focus primarily on graphite as a medium, and then as an extension to that, what would you recommend to people who want to take that sort of analog medium forward rather than the sort of saturated digital approach?
It helps that I work and build the final files for these posters on the computer in Photoshop all the time, but I don't really use Photoshop for anything more than a kind of a glorified paste-up machine. I make all the drawings practical. Even the color that's overlaid digitally will be scanned in, watercolors, and other materials that are put into there, because I think there's something, I don't personally enjoy the disconnect between writing on a screen or drawing with a stylus on a tablet. There's no responsive haptic experience that I get when my fingers are dirty and I'm getting in there and I've got ink and I've got stuff on my face, and I love to wrestle with the mud. And the lack of being surprised by accidents of inadvertent marks in digital work is not something that brings me any kind of inspiration and joy. So I don't really enjoy working digitally in that way. And I think that you're really coming into this stuff at a deep deficit. If you can't make a drawing on a piece of paper, you're not going to necessarily make a good drawing on a computer either. You might have a lot of flourishes and tricks and kind of fancy filters and, you know, little magical dust that you can throw on things to distract from a bad drawing, but that bad drawing is still there and it will still be a weak image, regardless of all the bells and whistles. You know, it's like if you can't cook a good hamburger, you shouldn't open a hamburger restaurant, no matter how awesome it is to go there, or whatever kind of theme craziness that's there. I mean, you know, the Hard Rock Cafe does not make good hamburgers, and I think it's that kind of lack of leaning on the clothing and ignoring the person wearing the suit that makes a lot of flatter or clunkier or wonky art. So for me, I've always been really enamored with just the fundamentals of art making, drawing, painting, you know, ink wash work. It's just, there's something about a relationship between an artist and a piece of paper that's so singular and so naked, and there's nowhere to hide. When you're doing a pencil sketch or a recursive drawing, there's just, once it's going, you're off and you can't stop. There's something so pure about that I think you can't capture digitally. So I always work practically if I can.
We have that same thing with when in songwriting. I believe that I should be able to make, if I'm writing a song, it needs to be able to stand up on one instrument and a voice.
Exactly.
So
I got to run. So
I know you've got to run. So so you've got the electric amp piece coming out with static medium. I know that, and that's why we're timing the session so that it's the next day.
That's right.
So yeah, I mean, it's a really cool piece.
Thank you.
And yeah, I know you've got to run, but people can see it on screen now, and they can get it through static medium. There's like 50 copies, right? I think.
There's only 50. I've signed. They sent them to me to sign, so they'll all be signed. And Static Medium is selling it from their shop and fulfilling it all on their side in California. They do amazing, wonderful work, and I got to know them through Mondo. They're the ones that printed up all the Twin Peaks stuff for us, and I think they're the go-to place for the G plays that they produce, and they do amazing work. And I love everybody there that works there. It's such a great playground to play in, and I love doing this Philip K. Dick thing for Folio, for this insane, gigantic collection of short stories that they put together. It was such an honor to be a part of that. And I had such a fun time doing that portrait for this, one of my favorite of his stories. It's one of those projects that just is a total gift. You feel like that you're becoming rewarded for something, you know, that I don't know what I did, but to be able to put all those wonderful parts together and to produce something like that, and now to finally have a poster of it or a nice 18 by 24 print. I couldn't be more excited for this thing. I can't wait for everybody to see it. They're gonna be so happy when they see them. I've got my copies here, and I was just looking at them, and they're so beautiful and they're so crisp, and the color is so saturated. Very excited. So
well, thank you very much for your time. I know we've gone quite a bit longer than probably than you expected, but thank you very much for your time, and thank you for sort of associating the release with it's great to have a link with that release. Thank you for everything. Sure.
It's my fault. I just overtalk all the time. I'm chatting.
It's okay.
I appreciate your patience.
It's all great stuff.
Well, anyway, thank you for having me here. Good luck with the rest of the show. It's such an incredible lineup.
Thank you.
It's a great privilege to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.